For over 4 decades, Edgar Cayce consistently delivered one of his most profound warnings across thousands of documented psychic readings. Objects belonging to the deceased, he revealed, could create invisible spiritual chains preventing souls from progressing in the afterlife. The very act of keeping certain items out of love and remembrance was actually harming the departed souls people sought to honor. Edgar Cayce, known worldwide as the Sleeping Prophet, conducted his psychic readings while in deep trance from his Virginia Beach home. His stenographer, Gladys Davis, meticulously recorded every word across 40 years, creating the most comprehensive collection of documented psychic material in modern history. These readings, preserved in the Association for Research and Enlightenment archives, consistently address the spiritual implications of our relationships with objects belonging to the deceased. Throughout his readings, Cayce taught that every physical object absorbs and retains the emotional and mental vibrations of its owner. This principle appears in hundreds of readings across decades of work, revealing how maintaining intense emotional attachments to deceased loved ones' belongings creates what he termed earthbound conditions. These conditions can hinder a departed soul's natural progression through higher spiritual dimensions. The most spiritually problematic objects fall into specific categories that might surprise many. Personal jewelry worn daily by the deceased, particularly wedding rings and religious items carrying deep emotional significance, top this list. Clothing items worn during emotionally intense periods represent another category of concern. Most surprisingly, Cayce's readings suggest that photographs taken during times of illness, depression, or spiritual struggle retain these lower vibrational imprints. In his documented teachings on psychic phenomena, Cayce explained that objects maintain active energetic connections to their former owner's consciousness. This principle appears consistently throughout his medical readings, life readings, and spiritual guidance sessions. Objects don't simply hold memories but create ongoing ties that can limit spiritual progression. Cayce didn't advocate heartless disposal of meaningful items. Instead, his readings outline a specific spiritual process for consciously releasing psychic attachments while maintaining healthy emotional connections to departed loved ones. This process involves prayer, meditation, and conscious intention to support both personal healing and the continued spiritual evolution of deceased souls. The documented principles behind Cayce's warnings reveal profound truths about consciousness itself. According to his readings, consciousness doesn't end at physical death but continues evolving through spiritual dimensions. Our earthbound attachments, including emotional investments in physical objects, can create energetic ties that limit this natural spiritual progression. This transforms traditional approaches to grief and memorial keeping. Cayce's teachings suggest that true love for the deceased means supporting their continued spiritual growth, not maintaining connections that keep them tied to earthbound conditions. Throughout his readings, he consistently taught that we are eternal souls having temporary physical experiences. Relationships with other souls continue beyond physical death but naturally evolve into forms supporting mutual spiritual advancement rather than emotional dependency. Family heirlooms and items of genuine historical or practical value carry different implications. Cayce's readings address this distinction clearly. The determining factor isn't the object itself but the consciousness and intention behind keeping it. Items maintained for spiritual value, historical significance, or practical use carry very different energetic implications than objects kept primarily as emotional anchors to the past. Objects used by the deceased for spiritual purposes, such as prayer books, meditation items, or tools used in service to others, can actually carry positive spiritual influences supporting growth. However, items kept primarily to maintain emotional connection or avoid the natural process of grief can hinder both our spiritual development and that of the departed soul. According to Cayce's documented spiritual philosophy, physical death represents graduation from one level of consciousness to another. Souls who have completed their earthbound lessons naturally seek to continue their education in higher spiritual dimensions. Our role as survivors involves supporting this continued evolution, not maintaining ties that might interfere with their natural spiritual progression. The documented wisdom in Cayce's readings shows that maintaining conscious spiritual connection with deceased loved ones through prayer, meditation, and service in their memory creates much healthier relationships than emotional attachment to physical belongings. This approach honors both our need for continued connection and their need for continued growth. The specific process Casey recommended for consciously evaluating and releasing objects from deceased loved ones appears in various forms throughout his documented readings. This process begins with entering a meditative or prayerful state and honestly examining our motivations for keeping each specific item. The first step involves holding the object while asking whether you're keeping it because it genuinely supports your spiritual life and positive memories, or because you're avoiding the natural process of grief and letting go. The second step involves what Casey called conscious communication with the departed soul. His documented teachings consistently affirm that souls and spiritual dimensions can perceive our thoughts and intentions. During meditation, express love for the departed person and sincere desire for their highest spiritual good. Ask them to help you understand whether keeping this particular item serves both souls' continued evolution. The third step requires paying careful attention to impressions, feelings, and guidance arising during this process. According to Casey's readings, we may receive clear spiritual direction through intuition, dreams, or meaningful synchronicities that help make appropriate decisions about inherited objects. If guidance comes to release an item, Casey's documented teachings recommend doing so with conscious intention and gratitude rather than sadness or guilt. His readings often suggest giving meaningful items to people who will use them positively, donating them to causes the deceased would have supported, or in some cases returning them to earth through burial while offering prayers for the soul's continued spiritual advancement. Casey's readings never advocate complete detachment from the memory of loved ones. Instead, they teach that the highest expression of love actively supports someone's continued spiritual evolution, whether they're currently in physical form or have graduated to other dimensions of existence. Documented healing experiences reported to the Association for Research and Enlightenment consistently show that people applying these principles report improved emotional well-being, more meaningful spiritual experiences, and stronger sense that their departed loved ones are progressing in soul development. Many discover that releasing physical attachments actually strengthens their spiritual connection with the deceased. Regarding wedding rings from deceased spouses, Casey's documented guidance suggests that spiritual appropriateness depends entirely on the consciousness behind wearing the ring. If it genuinely helps maintain connection to the eternal nature of love and supports continued spiritual growth, it may serve a positive purpose. However, if it keeps you emotionally bound to the past or prevents openness to new experiences supporting soul evolution, conscious release might serve your highest good. The fundamental principle underlying all of Casey's teachings on this topic is that genuine love seeks the beloved's highest spiritual good. This means supporting their continued soul development rather than maintaining connections that might limit their natural progression through higher dimensions of consciousness. According to his documented spiritual philosophy, we honor deceased loved ones most effectively by continuing our own spiritual development, serving others in their memory, and maintaining connection through prayer and meditation rather than through emotional attachment to material objects. His readings consistently teach that souls and spiritual dimensions are more easily able to support and communicate with us when we're focused on growth and service rather than grief and material attachments. Documented cases in the archives show that people consciously applying these principles often report beautiful dreams, meaningful synchronicities, and spiritual experiences they interpret as confirmation of their loved one's continued existence and well-being. Throughout his documented readings, Casey emphasized that understanding these spiritual principles doesn't diminish the reality of grief or the importance of processing loss. Instead, it provides a framework for transforming grief into spiritual wisdom and continued connection that supports everyone's highest development. The wisdom preserved in Edgar Casey's readings offers guidance remaining remarkably relevant for anyone seeking to understand the deeper spiritual dimensions of death, consciousness, and the continuation of relationships beyond physical existence. His documented teachings suggest that by approaching these sensitive topics with spiritual maturity and conscious intention, we can honor both our natural human emotions and the eternal spiritual realities governing soul development. The principles he shared aren't about creating distance from departed loved ones but about maintaining the healthiest possible spiritual connections supporting everyone's continued growth. The documented spiritual principles in Casey's readings reveal that we are all participating in an ongoing journey of soul development continuing through multiple dimensions of existence. Understanding and applying these principles with sincerity and love creates the foundation for relationships that transcend physical limitations and support the highest spiritual good of all souls involved. Modern psychology has begun exploring concepts that align with Casey's insights about grief, attachment, and spiritual healing. Research in thanatology, the study of death and dying, has identified different types of grief responses and their impact on psychological well-being. Complicated grief, characterized by prolonged intense yearning and difficulty accepting the reality of loss, often involves excessive attachment to physical reminders of the deceased. Studies show that while some memorial objects can support healthy grieving processes, excessive reliance on physical connections can impede emotional healing and adjustment. Neuroscientific research into grief has revealed how attachment behaviors activate specific brain regions associated with reward seeking and addiction. The intense emotional bonds we form with deceased loved ones' possessions can trigger neural pathways similar to those involved in substance dependence, creating physiological reinforcement for maintaining these attachments. This neurological evidence supports Casey's observations about how certain objects can create binding patterns that interfere with natural healing processes. Contemporary research in parapsychology has documented phenomena suggesting that consciousness may indeed continue beyond physical death. Studies of mediumship, near-death experiences, and after-death communications provide empirical support for Casey's assertions about ongoing relationships between deceased souls and living individuals. Researchers like Julie Bieshel at the Windbridge Research Center have conducted controlled studies demonstrating statistically significant evidence for information transfer from deceased individuals through mediums, suggesting that consciousness persists in some form after bodily death. The field of psychometry, the claimed ability to perceive information about objects through touch, has been investigated by researchers studying anomalous perception. While results remain controversial, some studies have documented instances where individuals accurately described historical information about objects' previous owners without prior knowledge. These findings lend credibility to Casey's assertions about objects retaining psychic impressions from their former owners. Environmental psychology research has explored how physical spaces and objects influence human consciousness and emotional states. Studies have shown that certain locations and items can trigger specific memories, emotions, and behavioral responses through mechanisms not fully understood by conventional science. This research supports the idea that our environments, including inherited objects, can profoundly influence our psychological and spiritual states. Research in quantum consciousness has begun exploring how quantum field effects might influence biological systems and conscious experience. Physicists like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose have proposed that consciousness emerges from quantum processes within brain microtubules, suggesting that awareness operates through quantum field interactions that could theoretically persist beyond physical death. While speculative, these theories provide conceptual frameworks for understanding how consciousness might continue existing and interacting across different dimensional states. The study of electromagnetic fields around living organisms has documented measurable biofield emissions that change with emotional states and health conditions. Research by scientists like Beverly Rubik has shown that these fields can be influenced by environmental factors and may serve as vehicles for information transfer between living systems. This research supports Casey's descriptions of how objects can retain and transmit energetic impressions from their previous owners. Investigations into the placebo effect have revealed how belief systems and emotional states can produce measurable physiological changes. Studies show that our expectations and emotional attachments can literally alter brain chemistry, immune function, and healing responses. This research validates Casey's emphasis on the importance of conscious intention and spiritual attitude in determining how objects and practices affect our well-being. Research in positive psychology has identified specific practices that promote resilience and post-traumatic growth following loss. Studies consistently show that meaning-making activities, service to others in memory of the deceased, and maintaining spiritual practices facilitate healthier grief processing. These findings align with Casey's recommendations for honoring deceased loved ones through continued spiritual development and service rather than attachment to material objects. The field of consciousness studies has documented various states of awareness that transcend ordinary waking consciousness. Research into meditation, prayer, and contemplative practices has shown that these activities can induce measurable changes in brain function and produce experiences of expanded awareness. Studies using neuroimaging have revealed that experienced meditators show increased activity in brain regions associated with empathy, compassion, and connection to others, supporting Casey's assertions about the value of prayer and meditation for maintaining healthy spiritual relationships. Clinical research into grief counseling has identified therapeutic approaches that help individuals process loss while maintaining meaningful connections to deceased loved ones. Continuing bonds theory, developed by researchers like Dennis Klass, recognizes that healthy grief processing often involves maintaining internal relationships with the deceased while adapting to their physical absence. This perspective aligns with Casey's teachings about transforming physical attachments into spiritual connections that support ongoing growth. Studies of ritual and ceremony in healing have documented how symbolic actions can facilitate psychological and spiritual transformation. Research shows that rituals involving conscious release, gratitude, and intention setting can produce measurable improvements in emotional well-being and stress reduction. These findings support Casey's recommendations for ceremonial approaches to releasing objects while maintaining spiritual connection. The emerging field of meaning-centered therapy has developed interventions specifically designed to help individuals find purpose and significance in loss experiences. Research by Viktor Frankl and others has shown that people who successfully integrate loss into a broader framework of meaning and spiritual growth demonstrate better psychological outcomes and greater life satisfaction. This therapeutic approach mirrors Casey's emphasis on viewing death and loss as opportunities for spiritual development rather than merely traumatic experiences to be endured. These scientific developments, while not proving every aspect of Casey's mystical teachings, create frameworks within which his insights about grief, consciousness, and spiritual relationships become increasingly plausible. The convergence of psychology, neuroscience, parapsychology, and consciousness research suggests that our relationships with deceased loved ones may indeed continue through dimensions of reality that transcend physical existence, exactly as Casey described through his clairvoyant perceptions. As our understanding of consciousness, grief, and the nature of existence continues expanding through scientific investigation, Casey's revelations about the spiritual significance of our relationships with objects from the deceased appear less like mystical speculation and more like advanced insights into the true nature of human consciousness and its continuation beyond physical death. The recognition that genuine love for the deceased involves supporting their continued spiritual evolution rather than maintaining limiting attachments may represent one of the most important spiritual principles we can apply in processing loss and honoring those who have transitioned to other dimensions of existence.